Have you ever noticed someone who has an Instagram account that's basically empty? No photos, no stories, nothing at all? At first glance, it looks like nothing, like maybe they're just busy or don't care much about social media. But if you pay attention a little longer, something strange starts to show up around that empty profile. These people usually aren't absent from the platform at all, even though their own page looks abandoned. They're watching everything, scrolling constantly, showing up quietly in the background of everyone else's life. They know what happened at the party they weren't invited to, and they knew it before you did. They're not disconnected from the world of social media. They're just invisible inside of it. And once you start noticing this pattern, it becomes almost impossible to unsee it again. Maybe you already know someone like this in your own life, someone who never posts no matter what happens. Maybe you've wondered why they stay quiet even when something exciting or important is going on for them. Maybe you've assumed they're private or humble or simply not interested in attention like the rest of us. Maybe you've even felt a little envious, imagining they somehow escaped the pressure everyone else seems to feel. But maybe there's something quieter happening underneath all of that, something worth actually looking at. Maybe silence isn't the absence of a story at all, but a story being carefully protected from view. If you're enjoying this conversation, consider subscribing for more psychology explained in a simple, honest way. Here's what's interesting about this whole pattern once you start digging into it a bit. Psychology often shows something very different from what we assume just by looking at the surface. What looks like indifference can actually be fear wearing a very convincing disguise. What seems like confidence in staying quiet can actually be a subtle, constant form of control. Because for a lot of people who never post, that blank profile isn't empty at all. It's a wall. And somewhere along the way, they built it on purpose. And behind that wall, something very human and very ordinary is quietly taking place. Let's start with a simple, everyday version of this pattern that you've probably seen before. Think about a friend who took an incredible trip last year and came back completely transformed. She has hundreds of beautiful photos sitting untouched on her phone, and she never posted a single one. At first, you might assume she forgot or that she was too busy living the moment to document it. But when you actually ask her about it, she says something a little different than you expect. She says that posting a moment somehow makes it start to feel like it belongs to everyone else. Once she shares it publicly, she explains, it quietly stops being fully hers anymore. That's only part of the picture, though, because there's another layer most people never notice at all. Think about a coworker who never posts anything about his promotions or his hard-earned achievements. He worked incredibly hard for years to get exactly where he is today in his career. Yet his profile shows almost nothing about any of it. No announcements, no celebration, nothing public at all. When people ask him why, he usually just shrugs and says it isn't really a big deal. But psychology suggests something more complicated is happening underneath that casual, dismissive shrug of his. Sometimes silence isn't modesty at all. It's actually a shield against being judged for trying too hard. If he never announces his wins publicly, nobody can accuse him of showing off or bragging. And nobody gets the chance to watch him fail out loud in front of everyone either. Now, consider someone who deleted their account completely after a difficult breakup a while back. They didn't want to keep seeing updates, and they didn't want anyone watching them process the pain. On the surface, this looks like a simple, healthy step toward healing and moving forward. Beneath that surface, though, something a lot more protective is quietly happening in the background.
Our minds naturally want some control over how much of ourselves the world can access at any moment. When life feels unstable or painful, disappearing for a while can genuinely feel like a form of safety. Many people unknowingly use invisibility the exact same way other people might use a locked door. Now, think about the quiet observer in your friend group, the one who likes almost everything but posts nothing. They know your life down to small details, while you barely know anything real about theirs. At first, this feels a little one-sided, maybe even slightly unfair if you really think about it. But there's often something surprisingly tender hiding underneath that noticeable imbalance between the two of you. Watching someone else's life from a comfortable distance can feel a lot safer than being watched yourself. It lets a person stay close to people they care about without ever fully exposing themselves in return. The brain often treats visibility itself as a kind of risk, even when nothing dangerous is actually happening. And for some people, that quiet sense of risk feels heavier than the loneliness of simply staying hidden. That's why so many quiet observers keep showing up again and again without ever stepping into the spotlight. Think about a college friend who quietly muted her own account right before graduation season began. Everyone else was posting caps and gowns, group photos, and long emotional captions about the years behind them. She simply watched from the sidelines, liking a few posts here and there without adding anything of her own. Later, she admitted that watching everyone celebrate made her feel strangely behind, even though nothing was actually wrong. Comparing her quiet, uncertain future to everyone else's polished captions felt harder than just staying silent altogether. So she chose invisibility, not because she didn't care about the moment, but because she cared too much. But that's only where this story really begins, because there's another detail most people completely overlook. A lot of people who avoid posting entirely aren't avoiding connection with others in any real sense. They're avoiding one very specific kind of exposure, and that distinction actually matters a whole lot here. They're not afraid of being seen by close friends who already understand and accept them fully. They're afraid of being quietly evaluated by an audience made up of everyone else watching too. One common psychological pattern shows up again and again once you start really paying attention to it. It's the fear of scrutiny, simply disguised as a casual lack of interest in social media itself. When you post something online, you're not just sharing a simple moment from your day. You're quietly submitting that moment for a kind of silent, ongoing public review by strangers and friends alike. Every single like becomes a tiny, almost invisible verdict on how that moment was actually received, and every missing like quietly becomes its own uncomfortable question hanging in the air. For some people, that constant low-level evaluation feels exhausting long before it ever starts to feel rewarding. So they opt out early, long before the evaluation even has a real chance to begin. It's simply easier to avoid the test completely than to risk failing it in front of everyone watching. And that naturally leads us to a deeper, more interesting question worth sitting with for a moment. Why would sharing something as simple as a photo start to feel like a test in the first place? At this point, something genuinely unexpected starts to happen if you keep following this thread further. This is exactly where things get even more interesting than they seemed just a minute ago. For a lot of people, the discomfort here isn't really about the photo itself at all. It's about identity, and how easily an entire identity can get misjudged by strangers online. A single picture gets flattened down into one simple story, and all the context quietly disappears. People who are highly aware of this tend to feel that pressure far more intensely than others do. They imagine every possible interpretation of a post long before they ever actually hit share. Will this look like bragging, or will it come across as somehow fake and performative instead? Will people think they're trying too hard, or maybe even worry that they're not trying hard enough? Eventually, the anxiety of imagining every possible reaction outweighs any pleasure the sharing might have actually brought them. So silence becomes the easier, safer choice, not because they don't care, but because they care too much. The real reason usually sits hidden beneath the surface, and it typically goes back further than social media itself. This doesn't necessarily make someone a bad person, or even an unusually anxious one deep down. Often, it's simply the way they quietly learned to protect themselves a long time ago. Some people grew up in homes where being noticed at all came with real, uncomfortable consequences. Attention often meant criticism, comparison, or a whole set of unwanted expectations placed on them. If a child's excitement was frequently met with judgment, they may quietly learn a lasting lesson from it. The lesson is simple, and it tends to stick around for years without them even realizing it. Being invisible feels safer than being seen, and that idea settles somewhere deep and quiet inside them. That lesson doesn't just disappear once someone grows into an adult with their own life. It simply changes shape over time, and social media eventually becomes its newest, most public test. Other people develop this same pattern through comparison rather than through direct, obvious criticism at home. They grew up watching other people get praised more easily, more often, and far more publicly than them. Over time, they quietly learned to associate visibility with the risk of losing instead of winning something. So they stopped competing for attention altogether because it felt safer to leave the game entirely. Interestingly, this particular pattern isn't always rooted in low self-esteem the way people usually assume it is. Sometimes, honestly, it's actually the complete opposite of what you'd expect at first. Some people carry such a strong, steady internal sense of self that they don't need outside validation at all. For them, posting feels unnecessary, almost like squeezing something whole into a much smaller, flatter version of itself. Their sense of identity simply doesn't need an audience anywhere in order to feel real and solid. There's also a quieter possibility worth considering, one that has nothing to do with fear or peace at all. Some people simply experience their own lives more vividly in memory than in any photograph they could take. For them, a moment fully lived feels more real than that same moment flattened into a single square image. Posting, for these people, isn't dangerous or threatening. It's just beside the point of what actually mattered. Which explains why two people can look completely identical from the outside, both silent, both absent from the feed. Yet they can be driven by two completely opposite inner worlds underneath that same quiet surface. One of them might be quietly afraid, while the other might genuinely be quietly at peace instead. This is exactly where everything starts connecting together, and it says something important about how we read people. The next time you notice someone who never posts anything, pause before assuming you already understand why. Ask yourself what might actually be happening underneath the surface instead of filling the silence in yourself. Notice whether their quietness feels anxious or genuinely grounded once you actually talk to them directly. Pause instead of quickly labeling them as private, mysterious, or simply uninterested in connecting with others. Reflect for a moment on the fact that visibility and confidence aren't always the exact same thing. Understand that some of the most secure people you know might actually be the quietest ones online. And once you understand that, you might respond a little differently the next time silence surprises you. Because honestly, this pattern reaches far beyond something as small as Instagram itself. It shows up everywhere. People quietly decide how much of themselves they're willing to reveal to others. Think about the friend who never talks about relationship problems, even when you can tell something is wrong. Think about the coworker who never mentions a side project until it has already fully succeeded. Think about the family member who quietly processes grief alone, long before anyone else even notices. Think about the neighbor who renovated their whole house but never mentioned it to a single soul online. Think about the new parent who keeps their baby's face completely off social media on purpose. In every single case, the same invisible calculation is quietly happening underneath the surface of things. How much exposure genuinely feels safe, and how much protection does a person actually need right now? Some people share early and often, using visibility itself as a way to feel supported by others. Other people share late or maybe never at all, using invisibility instead as their own form of safety. Neither approach is really right or wrong on its own, and that's genuinely worth remembering here. Each one simply reflects a different, very personal relationship with the idea of being seen by others. Understanding people doesn't mean excusing every single behavior, and it definitely doesn't require agreeing with all of it. It also doesn't mean assuming that every quiet silence is secretly hiding some kind of deep pain. Sometimes silence really is peace, plain and simple, with nothing complicated hiding underneath it at all. Sometimes it's protection, carefully built up over years without anyone else ever really noticing. And sometimes it's simply a preference that has absolutely nothing to do with fear in the first place. But when you stop assuming things so quickly and start actually noticing instead, something quietly begins to shift. The people around you slowly become a little less predictable, and honestly, a little more human, too. Sometimes awareness genuinely changes everything, even when nothing about the actual situation itself has changed at all. The biggest shift usually begins the moment an invisible pattern like this one finally becomes visible to you. If this perspective helped you see something a little differently today, consider subscribing for more conversations just like this one. Thank you so much for spending these quiet moments with me here today. I'll see you again soon in the next video we make together.